red. The skipper thrust his hand into one of his trouser pockets, and with difficulty, for they were not at the sides but in front, and he was a portly man, pulled out a large silver watch. He looked at it, and then looked again at the declining sun. The Kanaka, at the wheel, gave him a glance, but did not speak. The skipper's eyes rested on the island. They were approaching. A white line of foam marked the reef. He knew there was an opening large enough to get his ship through, and when they came a little nearer, he counted on seeing it. They had nearly an hour of daylight still before them. In the lagoon, the water was deep, and they could anchor comfortably. The chief of the village, which he could already see among the coconut trees, was a friend of the mate's, and it would be pleasant to go ashore for the night. The mate came forward at that minute, and the skipper turned to him. "We'll take a bottle of booze along with us, and get some girls in to dance," he said. "I don't see the opening," said the mate. He was a Kanaka, a handsome, swarthy fellow, with somewhat the look of a later Roman emperor, inclined to stoutness, but his face was fine and clean-cut. "I'm dead sure there's one right here," said the captain, looking through his glasses. "I can't understand why I can't pick it up. Send one of the boys up to the mast to have a look." The mate called one of the crew and gave him the order. The captain watched the Kanaka climb and waited for him to speak. But the Kanaka shouted down that he could see nothing but the unbroken line of foam. The captain spoke Samoan, like a native, and he cursed him freely. "Shall he stay up there?" asked the mate. "What the hell good does that do?" answered the captain. "The blame fool can't see worth a cent. You bet your sweet life I'd find the opening if I was up there." He looked at the slender mast with anger. It was all very well for a native who had been used to climbing up coconut trees all his life. He was fat and heavy. "Come down!" he shouted. "You're no more use than a dead dog. We'll just have to go along the reef till we find the opening." It was a 70-ton schooner with paraffin auxiliary, and it ran, when there was no headwind, between 4 and 5 knots an hour. It was a bedraggled object. It had been painted white a very long time ago, but it was now dirty, dingy, and mottled. It smelt strongly of paraffin, and of the copra, which was its usual cargo. They were within 100 feet of the reef now, and the captain told the steersman to run along it till they came to the opening. But when they had gone a couple of miles, he realized that they had missed it. He went about and slowly worked back again. The white foam of the reef continued without interruption, and now the sun was setting. With a curse at the stupidity of the crew, the skipper resigned himself to waiting till next morning. "Put her about," he said. "I can't anchor here." They went out to sea a little, and presently it was quite dark. They anchored. When the sail was furled, the ship began to roll a good deal. They said in Apia that one day she would roll right over, and the owner, a German-American who managed one of the largest stores, said that no money was big enough to induce him to go out in her. The cook, a Chinese in white trousers, very dirty and ragged, and a thin white tunic, came to say that supper was ready, and when the skipper went into the cabin, he found the engineer already seated at table. The engineer was a long, lean man with a scraggy neck. He was dressed in blue overalls and a sleeveless jersey, which showed his thin arms tattooed from elbow to wrist. "Hell, having to spend the night outside," said the skipper. The engineer did not answer, and they ate their supper in silence. The cabin was lit by a dim oil lamp. When they had eaten the canned apricots, with which the meal finished, the Chink brought them a cup of tea. The skipper lit a cigar and went on the upper deck. The island now was only a darker mass against the night. The stars were very bright. The only sound was the ceaseless breaking of the surf. The skipper sank into a deck chair and smoked idly. Presently, 3 or 4 members of the crew came up and sat down. One of them had a banjo, and another a concertina. They began to play, and one of them sang. The native song sounded strange on these instruments. Then to the singing a couple began to dance. It was a barbaric dance, savage and primeval, rapid, with quick movements of the hands and feet and contortions of the body. It was sensual, sexual even, but sexual without passion. It was very animal, direct, weird, without mystery, natural, in short, and one might almost say childlike. At last they grew tired. They stretched themselves on the deck and slept, and all was silent. The skipper lifted himself heavily out of his chair and clambered down the companion. He went into his cabin and got out of his clothes. He climbed into his bunk and lay there. He panted a little in the heat of the night. But next morning, when the dawn crept over the tranquil sea, the opening in the reef, which had eluded them the night before, was seen a little to the east of where they lay. The schooner entered the lagoon. There was not a ripple on the surface of the water. Deep down among the coral rocks, you saw little colored fish swim. When he had anchored his ship, the skipper ate his breakfast and went on deck. The sun shone from an unclouded sky, but in the early morning the air was grateful and cool. It was Sunday, and there was a feeling of quietness, a silence, as though nature were at rest, which gave him a peculiar sense of comfort. He sat, looking at the wooded coast, and felt lazy and well at ease. Presently a slow smile moved his lips, and he threw the stump of his cigar into the water. "I guess I'll go ashore," he said. "Get the boat out." He climbed stiffly down the ladder and was rowed to a little cove. The coconut trees came down to the river's edge, not in rows, but spaced out with an ordered formality. They were like a ballet of spinsters, elderly but flippant, standing in affected attitudes with the simpering graces of bygone age. He sauntered idly through them, along a path that could be just seen winding its tortuous way, and it led him presently to a broad creek. There was a bridge across it, but the bridge constructed of single trunks of coconut trees, a dozen of them, placed end to end and supported where they met by a forked branch driven into the bed of the creek. You walked on a smooth round surface, narrow and slippery, and there was no support for the hand. To cross such a bridge required sure feet and a stout heart. The skipper hesitated, but he saw on the other side, nestling among the trees, a white man's house. He made up his mind, and rather gingerly began to walk. He watched his feet carefully, and where one trunk joined on to the next, and there was a different of level. He tottered a little. It was with a gasp of relief that he reached the last tree and finally set his feet on the firm ground of the other side. He had been so intent on the difficult crossing that he never noticed anyone was watching him, and it was with surprise that he heard himself spoken to. It takes a bit of nerve to cross these bridges when you're not used to them. He looked up and saw a man standing in front of him. He had evidently come out of the house which he had seen. "I saw you hesitate," the man continued, with a smile on his lips, "and I was watching to see you fall in." "Not on your life," said the captain, who had now recovered his confidence. "I've fallen in myself before now. I remember one evening I came back from shooting, and I fell in, gun and all. Now I get a boy to carry my gun for me." He was a man no longer young, with a small beard, now somewhat grey, and a thin face. He was dressed in a singlet without arms, and a pair of duck trousers. He wore neither shoes nor socks. He spoke English with a slight accent. "Are you Nielsen?" asked the skipper. "I am." "I've heard about you. I thought you lived somewheres around here." The skipper followed his host into the little bungalow and sat down heavily in the chair which the other motioned him to take. While Nielsen went out to fetch whiskey and glasses, he took a look round the room. It filled him with amazement. He had never seen so many books. The shelves reached from floor to ceiling on all four walls, and they were closely packed. There was a grand piano littered with music, and a large table on which books and magazines lay in disorder. The room made him feel embarrassed. He remembered that Nielsen was a queer fellow. No one knew very much about him, although he had been in the islands for so many years. But those who knew him agreed that he was queer. He was a Swede. "You've got one big heap of books here," he said when Nielsen returned. "They do no harm," answered Nielsen, with a smile. "Have you read them all?" asked the skipper. "Most of them. I'm a bit of a reader myself. I have the Saturday Evening Post sent me regular." Nielsen poured his visitor a good stiff glass of whiskey and gave him a cigar. The skipper volunteered a little information. "I got in last night, but I couldn't find the opening, so I had to anchor outside. I never been this run before, but my people had some stuff they wanted to bring over here. Grade, you know him." "Yes, he's got a store a little way along." "Well, there was a lot of canned stuff that he wanted over, and he's got some copra." They thought, "I must just as well come over as lie idle at Apia. I run between Apia and Pago Pago mostly. But they've got smallpox there just now, and there's nothing stirring." He took a drink of his whiskey and lit a cigar. He was a taciturn man, but there was something in Nielsen that made him nervous, and his nervousness made him talk. The Swede was looking at him with large dark eyes in which there was an expression of faint amusement. "This is a tidy little place you've got here. I've done my best with it. You must do pretty well with your trees. They look fine, with copra at the price it is now. I had a bit of plantation myself once, in Upulo. It was, but I had to sell it." He looked round the room again, where all those books gave him a feeling of something incomprehensible and hostile. "I guess you must find it a bit lonesome here, though," he said. "I've got used to it. I've been here 25 years. Now the captain, could think of nothing more to say, and he smoked in silence. Nielsen had apparently no wish to break it. He looked at his guest with a meditative eye. He was a tall man, more than 6 feet high, and very stout. His face was red and blotchy, with a network of little purple veins on the cheeks, and his features were sunk into its fatness. His eyes were bloodshot. His neck was buried in rolls of fat. But for a fringe of long curly hair, nearly white, at the back of his head, he was quite bald, and that immense shiny surface of forehead, which might have given him a false look of intelligence, on the contrary gave him one of peculiar imbecility. He wore a blue flannel shirt, open at the neck, and showing his fat chest covered with a mat of reddish hair, and a very old pair of blue serge trousers. He sat in his chair in a heavy, ungainly attitude, his great belly thrust forward, and his fat legs uncrossed. All elasticity had gone from his limbs. Nielsen wondered idly what sort of man he had been in his youth. It was almost impossible to imagine that this creature of vast bulk had ever been a boy who ran about. The skipper finished his whiskey, and Nielsen put the bottle towards him. "Help yourself." The skipper leaned forward, and with his great hand seized it. "And how come you in these parts, anyway?" he said. "Oh, I came out to the islands for my health. My lungs were bad, and they said I hadn't a year to live. You see, they were wrong. I meant, how come you to settle down right here?" "I am a sentimentalist." "Oh." Nielsen knew that the skipper had not an idea what he meant, and he looked at him with an ironical twinkle in his dark eyes. Perhaps just because the skipper was so gross and dull a man, the whim seized him to talk further. "You were too busy keeping your balance to notice when you crossed the bridge, but this spot is generally considered rather pretty. It's a cute little house you've got here." "Ah, that wasn't here when I first came. There was a native hut, with its beehive roof and its pillars overshadowed by a great tree with red flowers, and the croton bushes, their leaves yellow and red and golden, made a pied fence around it. And then, all about, were the coconut trees, as fanciful as women and as vain. They stood at the water's edge, and spent all day looking at their reflections. I was a young man then. Good heavens, it's a quarter of a century ago. And I wanted to enjoy all the loveliness of the world in the short time allotted to me before I passed into the darkness. I thought it was the most beautiful spot I had ever seen. The first time I saw it, I had a catch at my heart, and I was afraid I was going to cry. I wasn't more than 25, and though I put the best face I could on it, I didn't want to die, and somehow it seemed to me that the very beauty of this place made it easier for me to accept my fate. I felt, when I came here, that all my past life had fallen away. Stockholm and its university, and then Bonn, it all seemed the life of somebody else, as though now at last I had achieved the reality which our doctors of philosophy, I am one myself, you know, had discussed so much. A year, I cried to myself, to have a year. I will spend it here, and then I am content to die. We are foolish and sentimental and melodramatic at 25, but if we weren't, perhaps we should be less wise at 50. Now drink, my friend. Don't let the nonsense I talk interfere with you." He waved his thin hand towards the bottle, and the skipper finished what remained in his glass. "You ain't drinking nothing?" he said, reaching for the whiskey. "I am of a sober habit," smiled the Swede. I intoxicate myself in ways which I fancy are more subtle, but perhaps that is only vanity. Anyhow, the effects are more lasting and the results less deleterious. They say there's a deal of cocaine taken in the States now, said the captain. Nielsen chuckled. But I do not see a white man often, he continued. And for once, I don't think a drop of whiskey can do me any harm. He poured himself out a little, added some soda, and took a sip. And presently I found out why the spot had such an unearthly loveliness. Here love had tarried for a moment, like a migrant bird that happened on a ship in mid-ocean, and for a little while folds its tired wings. The fragrance of a beautiful passion hovered over it like the fragrance of hawthorn in May in the meadows of my home. It seems to me that the places where men have loved or suffered keep about them always some faint aroma of something that has not wholly died. It is as though they had acquired a spiritual significance which mysteriously affects those who pass. I wish I could make myself clear. He smiled a little. Though I cannot imagine that if I did, you would understand. He paused. I think this place was beautiful because here I had been loved beautifully. And now he shrugged his shoulders. But perhaps it is only that my aesthetic sense is gratified by the happy conjunction of young love and a suitable setting. Even a man less thick-witted than the skipper might have been forgiven if he were bewildered by Nielsen's words. For he seemed faintly to laugh at what he said. It was as though he spoke from emotion, which his intellect found ridiculous. He had said himself that he was a sentimentalist, and when sentimentality is joined with skepticism, there is often the devil to pay. He was silent for an instant, and looked at the captain with eyes in which there was a sudden perplexity. You know, I can't help thinking that I've seen you before somewhere or other, he said. I couldn't say as I remember you, returned the skipper. I have a curious feeling as though your face were familiar to me. It's been puzzling me for some time, but I can't situate my recollection in any place or at any time. The skipper massively shrugged his heavy shoulders. It's 30 years since I first came to the islands. A man can't figure on remembering all the folk he meets in a while like that. The Swede shook his head. You know how one sometimes has the feeling that a place one has never been to before it's strangely familiar? That's how I seem to see you. He gave a whimsical smile. Perhaps I knew you in some past existence. Perhaps. Perhaps you were the master of a galley in ancient Rome, and I was a slave at the oar. 30 years have you been here? Every bit of 30 years. I wonder if you knew a man called Red? Red? That is the only name I've ever known him by. I never knew him personally. I never even set eyes on him, and yet I seem to see him more clearly than many men. My brothers, for instance, with whom I pass my daily life for many years. He lives in my imagination with the distinctness of a Paolo, Malatesta, or a Romeo. But I dare say you have never read Dante or Shakespeare? Can't say I have, said the captain. Nielsen, smoking a cigar, leaned back in his chair and looked vacantly at the ring of smoke which floated in the still air. A smile played on his lips, and his eyes were grave. Then he looked at the captain. There was in his gross, obesity something extraordinarily repellent. He had the plethoric self-satisfaction of the very fat. It was an outrage. It set Nielsen's nerves on edge. But the contrast between the man before him and the man he had in mind was pleasant. It appears that Red was the most comely thing you ever saw. I've talked to quite a number of people who knew him in those days, white men, and they all agree that the first time you saw him, his beauty just took your breath away. They called him Red on account of his flaming hair. It had a natural wave, and he wore it long. It must have been of that wonderful color that the pre-Raphaelites raved over. I don't think he was vain of it. He was much too ingenuous for that, but no one could have blamed him if he had been. He was tall, 6 feet and an inch or two. In the native house that used to stand here was the mark of his height, cut with a knife on the central trunk that supported the roof, and he was made like a Greek god, broad in the shoulders and thin in the flanks. He was like Apollo, with just that soft roundness with Praxiteles gave him, and that suave, feminine grace, which has in it something troubling and mysterious. His skin was dazzling white, milky like satin. His skin was like a woman's. "I had kind of a white skin myself when I was a kiddie," said the skipper, with a twinkle in his bloodshot eyes. But Nielsen paid no attention to him. He was telling his story now, and interruption made him impatient. And his face was just as beautiful as his body. He had large blue eyes, very dark, so that some say they were black, and unlike most red-haired people, he had dark eyebrows and long dark lashes. His features were perfectly regular, and his mouth was like a scarlet wound. He was 20. On these words, the Swede stopped with a certain sense of the dramatic. He took a sip of whiskey. He was unique. There never was anyone more beautiful. There was no more reason for him than for a wonderful blossom to flower on a wild plant. It was a happy accident of nature. One day he landed at the cove into which you must have put this morning. He was an American sailor, and he had deserted from a man-o'-war in Apia. He had induced some good-humored native to give him a passage on the cutter that happened to be sailing from Apia to Safoto, and he had been put ashore here in a dugout. I do not know why he deserted. Perhaps life on the man-o'-war, with its restrictions, irked him. Perhaps he was in trouble, and perhaps it was the South Seas and these romantic islands that got into his bones. Every now and then they take a man strangely, and he finds himself like a fly in a spider's web. It may be that there was a softness of fibre in him, and these green hills, with their soft airs, this blue sea, took the northern strength from him, as Delilah took the Nazarites. Anyhow, he wanted to hide himself, and he thought he would be safe in this secluded nook till his ship had sailed from Samoa. There was a native hut at the cove, and as he stood there wondering where exactly he should turn his steps, a young girl came out and invited him to enter. He knew scarcely 2 words of the native tongue, and she as little English, but he understood well enough what her smiles meant, and her pretty gestures, and he followed her. He sat down on a mat, and she gave him slices of pineapple to eat. I can speak of Red only from hearsay, but I saw the girl 3 years after he first met her, and she was scarcely 19 then. You cannot imagine how exquisite she was. She had the passionate grace of the hibiscus and the rich color. She was rather tall, slim, with the delicate features of her race, and large eyes like pools of still water under the palm trees. Her hair, black and curling, fell down her back, and she wore a wreath of scented flowers. Her hands were lovely. They were so small, so exquisitely formed, they gave your heartstrings a wrench. And in those days she laughed easily. Her smile was so delightful that it made your knees shake. Her skin was like a field of ripe corn on a summer day. Good heavens! How can I describe her? She was too beautiful to be real. And these two young things, she was 16 and he was 20, fell in love with one another at first sight. That is the real love, not the love that comes from sympathy, common interest, or intellectual community, but love pure and simple. That is the love that Adam felt for Eve when he awoke and found her in the garden gazing at him with dewy eyes. That is the love that draws the beasts to one another and the gods. That is the love that makes the world a miracle. That is the love which gives life its pregnant meaning. You have never heard of the wise, cynical French duke who said that with two lovers there is always one who loves and one who lets himself be loved. It is a bitter truth to which most of us have to resign ourselves. But now and then there are two who love and two who let themselves be loved. Then one might fancy that the sun stands still as it stood when Joshua prayed to the God of Israel. And even now, after all these years, when I think of these two, so young, so fair, so simple, and of their love, I feel a pang. It tears my heart, just as my heart is torn when on certain nights I watch the full moon shining on the lagoon from unclouded sky. There's always pain in the contemplation of perfect beauty. They were children. She was good and sweet and kind. I know nothing of him, and I like to think that then, at all events, he was ingenuous and frank. I like to think that his soul was as comely as his body, but I dare say he had no more soul than the creatures of the woods and forest who made pipes from reeds and bathed in the mountain streams when the world was young. And you might catch sight of little fawns galloping through the glade on the back of a bearded centaur. A soul is a troublesome possession, and when man developed it, he lost the Garden of Eden.